In a world that's increasingly bizarre, one question remains. What's really going on? Join us on The Daily Absurd as we delve into the strange corners of reality, exploring the stories that make you scratch your head and say, is this real life?
All right, so we've got a ton of articles here about the day the music died.
Yeah.
That plane crash back in '59 that took Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and JP the Big Bopper Richardson. It's crazy how, even after all this time, it still feels like such a huge loss.
It really is. It's not just about those three guys.
Right.
It's like this event became a symbol for something bigger, like a whole generation losing its innocence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To really get why it hit so hard, we've got to look at what was going on back then.
Right, the context.
Yeah, like what led up to that flight.
Well, they were on this tour called the Winter Dance Party, and honestly,
Yeah.
one article called it the Tour from Hell. And reading these articles,
I can see why.
24 cities in 24 days in the middle of winter. That's just brutal.
And remember, this was before the interstate highway system.
Oh, right.
So you're talking about these guys traveling on frozen back roads and buses that were barely holding together.
Yeah, these articles don't hold back on the details. Waist deep snow, sub-zero temperatures, buses breaking down with no heat. Oh, yeah.
It's no wonder some of them were getting sick on top of everything else.
Exactly. I mean, Richardson and Valens were fighting the flu. Holly's drummer had frostbite.
It's unbelievable.
They were exhausted, both physically and mentally.
You can really sense that desperation building as you read these accounts.
Oh, totally.
So they finally get to Clear Lake, Iowa, after driving 350 miles from their last show in Wisconsin.
Wow.
And get this, their next show is in Moorhead, Minnesota. Another insanely long drive.
Oh, man.
So Buddy Holly, completely fed up with the butt situation, decides to charter a plane.
Makes sense.
Seems like a pretty simple decision at the time, but
Yeah.
it ends up changing everything. And then the story takes this almost eerie turn when Waylon Jennings gives up his seat on the plane to Richardson because he's so sick.
Oh, wow.
And then Tommy Alsop loses his seat to Valens on a coin toss.
Can you imagine being Alsop or Jennings, looking back on that moment?
I know, right?
Chills.
Totally. So now you've got Holly, Valens, and Richardson, along with this 21-year-old pilot, Roger Peterson, taking off from Mason City, Iowa, in a Beechcraft Bonanza.
Beechcraft Bonanza, huh?
Yeah. And it's important to remember that the weather was awful that night. Light snow, low clouds, strong winds.
Right, all playing a role.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the plane crashes just a few miles from the airport.
Yeah.
No survivors.
It's just
Awful.
awful. The investigation after the crash mostly blamed Peterson, said he wasn't qualified to fly in those conditions and that there were some issues with the weather briefing he got. Just a whole bunch of terrible circumstances coming together that night.
Yeah, just a perfect storm of bad luck. So we've talked about the crash and the investigation, but these articles also do a really good job of showing us who these guys actually were,
Yeah, for sure.
It's easy to forget they weren't just names in a news story.
Right.
They're the top of their game,
Yeah.
shaping the sound of a generation.
And when you learn about them as individuals,
Yeah.
it makes it even more tragic.
Absolutely. Let's start with Buddy Holly.
Okay.
22 years old when he died,
So young.
but already a rock and roll icon.
The glasses, the Fender Stratocaster.
Right. You see a picture and you know exactly who it is.
Instantly recognizable even today.
What always gets me about his music is how he blended all these different styles.
Yeah.
Country, gospel, even some R&B.
It's true.
And it created this sound that was both familiar and completely new.
That's what's so interesting about Buddy Holly.
Yeah, and you can hear those influences in so much music that came after him.
For sure.
One source called him a restless innovator, and you can really see that in the way he was always experimenting with recording techniques.
Like what?
Well, he was one of the first to use double tracking on vocals,
Oh, wow.
which adds this whole other layer to the sound.
So that was him. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was groundbreaking at the time, and it influenced so many artists who came after him.
Like who?
The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton.
Mm-hmm.
They all talk about how much Buddy Holly inspired them.
It really makes you wonder what he would have gone on to do.
Right, if he'd had more time.
Yeah, it's a question that hangs over this whole story, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, now let's talk about Ritchie Valens.
The pioneer of Chicano rock.
Another incredible talent, gone way too soon.
Only 17.
17. It's hard to even comprehend that.
It really is.
But he'd already made such a huge impact with Donna and La Bamba.
Oh man, La Bamba. That song is just...
Iconic.
Yeah, and it shows exactly what made him so special, taking a traditional Mexican folk song and turning it into a rock and roll anthem.
Exactly. He was bridging cultures.
Yeah.
Introducing Latin rhythms to a whole new audience.
And it wasn't just some novelty act, you know?
Right.
His music had this raw energy and joy to it.
You can't help but move when you hear it.
Absolutely. And his influence on Latin rock is undeniable. Carlos Santana, Los Lobos.
It all goes back to Ritchie Valens.
In some way, yeah. He broke down barriers and created a space for other Latinx artists.
Amazing. And then we have JP, the Big Bopper, Richardson.
The Texan with that big voice.
And the larger-than-life personality.
Oh, yeah. And Chantilly Lake.
Oh, come on. That's a classic.
Still gets played everywhere. Weddings, parties.
He knew how to entertain, that's for sure.
He did.
One article called him a pioneer of rock and roll radio.
Interesting.
Because he used his humor and personality to build this huge following.
He was more than just a musician, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
He was a personality, a true entertainer.
And you can see his influence in all those flamboyant performers who came after him, like Jerry Lee Lewis.
Right, and Elvis.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to imagine what music would have been like if they'd all lived.
I know, what would they have created?
How would they have pushed the boundaries of rock and roll even further?
It's one of the biggest what-ifs in music history.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a big part of why this story is so powerful, you know?
Why?
Because it reminds us how fragile life is and how quickly things can change.
That's very true.
But it's also a reminder of how powerful their music was and still is.
Yeah.
It's still played and loved by people all over the world.
That's right.
They may be gone, but their legacy lives on.
For sure. And in the next part, we'll look closer at that legacy.
Okay.
What the day the music died has come to represent in our culture.
Okay, so we've covered the crash, the investigation,
Right.
and who Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were as artists.
Yeah.
But what I find so fascinating is how this event, the day the music died, it's become so much bigger than just a plane crash, you know?
Really has, yeah.
It's like it's woven into our culture now.
Yeah.
These articles mention songs, books, films.
Even annual memorial concerts.
Right. At the Surf Ballroom where they played their last show.
It's like their absence created this void
Yeah.
that everyone's been trying to fill ever since.
Don McLean's American Pie,
Yeah.
obviously, is the most famous example.
Oh, yeah, with that line, the day the music died.
Exactly.
But there's so many other works out there
Right.
that look at this event from different angles.
Like the films, the Buddy Holly story and La Bamba.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
They really bring these guys to life, you know?
They do.
Show their personalities, their struggles, their dreams.
It's not just about remembering the tragedy, though, is it?
Right.
These tributes also introduce their music to new generations.
And it's working, too.
Oh, yeah.
You see young people today wearing Buddy Holly glasses,
I love that.
discovering Ritchie Valens' music,
Yeah.
singing along to Chantilly Lace.
It's amazing how timeless their music is.
It really is. Even the crash site itself has become like a pilgrimage for fans.
I read about that, yeah.
It's a somber place, but it also shows how deeply people connect with these artists and their music, you know?
It's true.
People leave flowers, photos, mementos, guitar picks.
Oh,
It's like this collective grief, even for those of us who weren't alive back then.
I get that.
There's this sense of loss, of potential cut short,
Yeah.
that resonates across generations.
And I think it goes beyond just these three musicians. The day the music died has become the symbol of lost innocence,
Yeah.
of a moment when everything changed.
Some music historians say it marked a turning point for rock and roll, too,
Oh, really?
like a shift in energy.
Yeah.
The early 60s saw this rise in teen idols and pop music,
Okay.
a move away from that rawness and rebellion that Holly, Valens, and Richardson embodied.
It's hard to say for sure what would happen if they had lived, of course,
Yeah.
but you can't deny that their absence had a huge impact on how rock and roll evolved.
For sure. But their music is still here.
Right.
It reminds us of the power of creativity,
Of following your dreams.
the joy that rock and roll can bring.
That's their legacy, right?
I think so.
The music they left behind and the impact they continue to have.
It's amazing to think about, really.
It is.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what stands out to you most about this whole story?
I think for me, it's just a reminder that even though they died young, their spirit lives on through their music, you know? And it's up to us to keep sharing that music and keep their memory alive.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this one.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.